The unwanted bride, Sarah Jennings had long since accepted the label the town had given her. At 28, unmarried and quiet, she was whispered about at every church gathering and market day as the county's old maid, a woman whose chance at love had supposedly passed her by. She kept to herself, tending her father's small farm and the modest schoolhouse where she taught the town's children, never imagining that her quiet life would be appended by a decision made entirely without her consent. It was the town council, led by the domineering Mayor Higgins, who arranged it, a marriage between Sarah and Colt Bennett, the county's most stubborn and reclusive rancher, as a way to settle a decades-old land dispute between their two families. Neither Sarah nor Colt had been asked. They had simply been informed, summoned to the church one autumn morning and told, in no uncertain terms, that the future of both their properties depended on this union. Sarah stood at the altar in a plain gray dress, humiliation burning in her cheeks, while Colt Bennett arrived late, dust still clinging to his boots, his jaw set in obvious resentment. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes that rarely softened, known throughout the county for his short temper and his refusal to sell even an acre of his struggling ranch. Rumors painted him as difficult, unlovable, a man destined to die alone on his land rather than compromise with anyone. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Colt barely looked at her, offering only a curt nod before striding out of the church. Without a single word of comfort, the ride to his ranch was silent, tense, the autumn wind sharp against Sarah's face as she clutched her single trunk, wondering what kind of life awaited her with a man who seemed to despise the very arrangement that bound them together. When they arrived, the ranch house was modest but sturdy, surrounded by fields that, despite the county's whispers of failure, showed signs of careful, determined labor. Colt showed her to a small room without ceremony, muttering that she should make herself comfortable, before disappearing to the barn for the remainder of the evening. Days passed in strained silence between them, two strangers sharing a home neither had chosen, both nursing wounds from a lifetime of being underestimated and dismissed by the very community that had forced them together. Sarah busied herself with the household, discovering in the process a quiet competence Colt hadn't expected. She mended fences alongside him without complaint, tended sick livestock with surprising skill, and organized his neglected accounts with a sharp, capable mind that unsettled his assumptions about the woman he'd been forced to marry. One evening, as a sudden storm rolled across the plains, Sarah noticed Colt struggling alone to secure the barn against the wind, his usual stoic composure cracking under the strain of managing everything by himself. Without hesitation, she grabbed a coat and ran out into the rain to help him, working alongside him as thunder cracked overhead, neither of them speaking, both simply working toward the same desperate goal. When the barn was finally secured, they stood soaked and breathless in the aftermath, and for the first time, Colt looked at her, really looked at her, with something other than resentment in his eyes. "You're not what they said you'd be," he admitted quietly, rain dripping from his hat. "Neither are you," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Neither of them realized, in that storm-soaked moment of unexpected understanding, that Sarah carried a secret of her own, one that would soon ripple far beyond their small ranch and shake the foundations of the entire county. The secret in the ledger. The truth began to surface weeks later, when Sarah discovered old documents tucked away in her late father's belongings, deeds, letters, and a ledger revealing that her family had once owned a significant portion of land, now claimed by Mayor Higgins himself, land that had been fraudulently transferred decades earlier through a manipulated inheritance dispute. Sarah's hands trembled as she read through the papers late into the night, realizing that the very man who had orchestrated her humiliating, forced marriage had built much of his fortune on land stolen from her own family. She debated for days whether to reveal what she'd found, fearing the consequences of confronting a man as powerful and vindictive as Higgins. But when she finally showed the documents to Colt, expecting skepticism or dismissal, she found instead a fierce and immediate ally. Colt's own family had suffered under Higgins's manipulations for years, losing grazing rights and water access through schemes disguised as legal agreements. Together, they realized their forced marriage, orchestrated by Higgins to settle what he believed was a minor land dispute, had inadvertently united to families with every reason to expose him. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Colt worked side by side, poring over old records at the county courthouse, tracking down aging witnesses who remembered the original and transfers, and slowly piecing together undeniable evidence of Higgins's decades-long fraud. Their partnership deepened with each discovery, the walls of resentment enforced, circumstance crumbling as they found in each other a fierce, unexpected loyalty. Sarah marveled at Colt's quiet determination, his refusal to back down despite the risks, while Colt found himself increasingly drawn to Sarah's sharp intelligence and unshakable resolve, qualities the town had never bothered to notice beneath her reserved exterior. As their investigation deepened, so did the bond between them, evolving from strangers bound by obligation into genuine partners who trusted and respected one another. Late evenings spent reviewing documents by lamplight gave way to quiet conversations about their pasts, their fears, and the loneliness both had carried long before their forced union. Sarah began to see past Colt's gruff exterior to the devoted, hard-working man beneath, someone who had simply never been given a reason to soften until now. Colt, in turn, recognized in Sarah a strength and resilience that had nothing to do with the county's cruel nickname, and everything to do with a woman who had quietly endured far more than anyone realized. But as word began to spread that Sarah and Colt were investigating old land records, Higgins grew increasingly desperate, resorting to threats and intimidation to protect the fortune he'd built on decades of deception. Sarah received an anonymous warning to abandon her inquiries, and shortly after, a fire mysteriously broke out in Colt's northern barn, destroying valuable feed stores just before winter. Rather than frightening them into silence, however, these attacks only strengthened their resolve, confirming that they were closer to the truth than Higgins could afford to allow. Standing together amid the wreckage of the burned barn, Sarah and Colt made a solemn vow to see the truth exposed, whatever the cost, a vow that would soon put both their futures and their newfound love to the ultimate test, the reckoning. The confrontation came on a cold winter morning, when Sarah and Colt finally presented their evidence before the entire county at a public hearing. Documents and witness testimonies laid bare for everyone to see. Mayor Higgins, confident in his decades of unchallenged authority, arrived expecting to easily dismiss the accusations of a rancher and a schoolteacher he'd once considered inconsequential. Instead, he found himself facing an overwhelming case built meticulously over months of painstaking work, supported by aging neighbors who finally found the courage to speak the truth they'd long kept silent out of fear. As the evidence mounted, Higgins's composure began to crack, his desperate denials growing increasingly hollow against the weight of original deeds, forged signatures, and first-hand accounts of his manipulations. The county that had once dismissed Sarah as an old maid and Colt as a hopeless recluse watched in stunned silence as the two people they'd forced together revealed the corruption that had shaped the community's very foundations for decades. By the hearing's end, Higgins's authority lay in ruins, his fraudulent land claims overturned, his reputation destroyed by the very couple he had believed powerless to challenge him. In the aftermath, Sarah and Colt found themselves not merely vindicated, but transformed, both in the eyes of their community and in their understanding of each other. The land wrongfully taken from both their families was rightfully restored, expanding their combined ranch into one of the most prosperous in the county. But more significant than the material gain was the partnership they had forged through adversity, a bond built not on the obligation that had first bound them together, but on genuine respect, shared struggle, and a love neither of them had expected to find within a marriage neither had chosen. The town that had once whispered cruel nicknames now spoke of Sarah and Colt with newfound admiration, recognizing in their quiet determination a strength that had ultimately protected the entire community from decades of hidden corruption. Neighbors who had once avoided Colt's gruff demeanor now sought his counsel, while parents who had once pitied Sarah's unmarried status now held her up as an example of quiet resilience and intelligence. Sarah and Colt, in turn, found themselves gradually embracing roles as respected leaders within the very community that had once dismissed them both as spring arrived, transforming the ranch's fields into vibrant green pastures. Sarah and Colt stood together on the same hill where they'd once secured the barn. Against that fateful storm, now looking out over land that belonged rightfully to both their families once more. Colt reached for her hand, no longer out of obligation, but genuine affection, and Sarah laced her fingers through his without hesitation, both of them finally understanding that the marriage, forced upon them, had led not to the misery everyone expected, but to a partnership stronger and more genuine than either had dared to hope for. Looking out over the land they had fought so hard to reclaim, Sarah realized that the secret she'd once feared would tear her new marriage apart had instead become the very foundation upon which she and Colt built an unshakable bond, proof that sometimes the most unexpected unions become the strongest, and that true partnership is forged not in comfort, but in facing life's hardest battles side by side. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful love stories filled with secrets, resilience, and unforgettable romance. New episodes are coming soon, and you won't want to miss what happens next.